Hi, this is David Halem, and you're listening to Liminal Rain from my story, Status Stranded. I hope you enjoy. This isn't the end. That's why I lost it. My composure. My mind was racing. Suddenly, I was thinking about Mard shooting one of the Javiros. Suddenly, I was thinking about Gregor being violently killed, slaughtered by her mother. Rage boiled and surged through my veins because of her. Like how her awful glass blade went down Varney's throat, her entire influence over my life hammered inside my mind. That beautiful, terrible day years ago. The love of my life was spared by some unforeseen grace, but the comfort of my soul was shot in the neck. There were days before she became this way, and I scarcely remember them. I had to be 4 or 5 when we learned that the world was certainly ending. And then it did, and she is still as alive as ever. No, she was alive in one sense. But now the only thing I can compare her existence to is a terrible legend. An awful poltergeist that will haunt me until I lay dead. Suddenly, I was thinking about Varney. His poor, precious soul didn't deserve this. Hosna has the sorrowful job of telling the rest of the group what had happened, as Allie and I make attempts to settle in our room. Not even seconds have passed and I was still screaming. My voice scratched and was starting to feel hoarse from the stress and agony that burned and blazed through my chest and coiled around my brain. I dropped to my knees, my shoulders slack and shaking. The images of Gregor and Varney brutally killed by the hands of my mother, and the consent of my mouth, and the willingness of their souls. I hate it all. I hate that this happened. I fucking despise that it escalated this far. My screaming weakened as another second passed. I felt my heart beat everywhere. I was choking up, but there were no tears to accompany my sobbing noises, only the pitiful emotion that radiated from my chest. Allie didn't make a sound, but she still called out. I turned my body to face her. She was still wearing Bridget's armor. This armor that saved her life. She, herself, was shaking far more than I was, because she was seeing me reacting like this. I looked at her, and it was then that the tears fell from my eyes. Her perfect face, that heavy laceration against her face, was gone, and not even a scar remained. Human, but more. My fiancé, but more. I couldn't keep steady breaths as I stood up and joined her on her bed, on top of the covers. I looked into her eyes. Beautiful, scarred, scared, teal eyes. The last time her eyes looked this lost was the day her father died. I put my hand out to put my arm around her and she flinched. Following the flinch, she shuddered. Her voice cracked, and she weakly said, I'm not okay. I sniffled at everything. I wiped a tear away and answered, I'm not either. I turned my hand and read the poem to myself. I will be counting the stars in the sky, but I will take time to say these perfect words. I love you. I looked up at her from my hand, and she was reading the poem on hers, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at me. Everything I saw at this moment was beautiful in its own broken way. The blue light from the sun glowed a sky-blue luminescence against her tear-moist face. The same light made the colors of the armor she wore mute as the blues failed to mix. The blue light filtered out the blue in her eyes and left the green as bright as the forest I wish I could have seen. Her face, she's tired from everything that happened today, and then she had to fight to the death against my mother. But she still has a small bout of thankfulness. This part is all over. And now, we figure this out and move on. She reached out her hand, palm facing up. I took her hand and put my arms around her in a way where I hugged her from behind. Her trembling was mixed with her heartbeats. Likewise, I wasn't feeling peaceful either. She let out an exasperated noise that preceded rhythmic sobbing. I held her close and tight, resting my chin on her head as she rested her tear-wet cheek on my shoulder. I was still tearing up from everything that had happened, and some of my tears were finding resting places in Allie's hair. She calmed down enough to finally say something. "I feel like a monster," she said softly. I moved a hand to the side of her head and held her close. A monster? I shook my head. There were worse monsters on Earth, and we've seen far more monstrous things out here. But she knows that. Allie, no. She shook her head. I destroyed her. Her voice cracked. I cut her face into imperfect halves. No one goes and does that. I held her closer. She's gone, Allie. You killed her. There was more force to her words now. I know, Allie. After all those years of her breaking me and hurting us, she's gone. She took in a deeper, shaking breath. And that makes me more powerful than her, and I don't like that. She paused and breathed in a tired, angry breath. She abused you, she demeaned me, she killed people we love, but she didn't kill you, I interjected, my voice almost in a pleading tone. She sniffled and shook in my arms as she spoke. She may as well have, and she left this monster to take my place. I took a deep breath as I held her close. Then finally the words came to me. If you really were a monster, none of us would be on this ship. She took a deep breath and shook her head slowly. I don't know anymore. I nodded before saying anything. I think both of us need some time to calm down before we do anything major, like visiting another planet or interacting with other ships, I said. We're in no position to do such things. There was a long pause on her end before she said anything. I guess that sounds okay. A small bout of relief flushed through the anxiety that I felt. I'm going to have Qadir and Ojore lead for us until we're more peaceful. And sometime soon, Slainie is going to come in and do medical examinations on us. In the wake of all this, I explained. She sighed. I trust them more than I trust myself right now. I didn't say anything to her, but I agreed in my mind. Still holding her close, I pulled out my radio and chose the target frequencies before speaking into it. Qadir, Ojore. A second passed before I heard both of them respond. Yes, sir. I paused before giving the order. Until further notice, Allie and I are out of commission. We have some heavy things to figure out before we are stable enough to lead you again. I could hear a short discussion on the other end before one of them answered. We are honored, sir. Thank you. And get well soon. That sounded like Qadir's voice, but it was something that Ojore would have said. I nodded. Thank you. What's the situation on the planet? There was a short pause before one of them answered. Don't know, but when I was down there, a shop had some kind of countdown for something. I asked what it was, and they said something about a Ojore storm. I don't know anything about that. A what? I don't know. They said that if you're caught outside, you disappear. The guy said it was happening soon, so it was good that we got out of there when we did. Don't want to disappear. I nodded. Yeah, don't want to do that. Allie and I certainly want some experiences to disappear, and that's what our cloistered time was for. Nonetheless, 3 weeks passed. Nothing was resolved, but our minds aren't as haywire as they were 3 weeks ago when we took over the Brechtons. It feels so stupid that for 3 weeks that's all that happened. Lack of progress. Every day was the same. We don't know how to get anywhere emotionally in spite of what we had gone through that day. I sighed at the sad thought as Allie and I followed Hosna to our Brechton ship. She is going to introduce us to the different fighters from the Brechton fleet. She told us that because of translation from the Soto, we don't get their exact names, but an interpretation of what their names mean. That isn't the case for each of them, but for a decent amount of them. There were dozens of different aliens and otherwise that Hosna has at her disposal, but there were only a few that stood out to me. One of them was no taller than my waist. She reminded me of the tattoo artist that did Allie and I's poems. This one looked female. She had little blue eyes and long black hair that was put in a tight arrangement close to her head. Her name was Transparency. Another one was the total opposite of Transparency in almost every way. He was a large black man. He was at least a foot taller than I was, making him over 7 feet tall. He wasn't tall and slim. He was massive. And he had to weigh no less than 400 pounds by himself. But what made him stand out so much to me was the extra accessories that were attached to him. Embedded into his arms were silver chains with links the size of my fist. One of his hands looked entirely mechanical, and he had silver mechanical wings on his back that, when fully expanded, were 20 feet from wingtip to wingtip. The wings had razor fish hooks in dozens of places on different parts of the structure, and there were also reserves of chains on his wings as well. His name was Delmont. There was a third alien that stood out to me. This one gave me the impression of a cat human. He even had a tail. He was a little shorter than I was and had black and white fur. I could imagine that if he were a cat on Earth, he would be called Socks because of his fur. He had sky blue cat eyes, and presently the pupils were dilated. His cat ears perked up, making a very familiar cat frame in doing so. The only strange thing about this cat was that it was anthropomorphic, and his name was Glide. Out of an odd and morbid curiosity, I looked at the Soto accomplice that we had with us, and looked to see if there was any reaction to Glide the cat. They didn't seem to care too much about each other in any way. Allie and I were introduced to the other few fighters that Hosna decided to show us. I'm sure that there was some significance to them all that could be 100 or 200 fighters of this ship. But everything felt like I was putting so much effort just to make sure I was still focused on the space in front of me and any amount of people there. My radio toned as we were walking through the main Brechton ship towards our ship in the loading deck. "Rain," voice said. "Yes, I'm here." "There is a distress call from the Fortis territory." That sounded strange to me. From the little bit I had learned about the Fortis, they are the most powerful military force in this part of the galaxy. Nonetheless, I asked, "What is the nature of the distress?" "There is a skirmish on their homeworld, Fortis against another race." "What is the other race?" I asked. "We don't know. There are some eyewitness reports that say that this race is one that has been endangered for dozens of UTUs. I turned to Allie. "What do you want to do?" It took Allie a second before she answered. "Maybe helping them will help us." "Allie, we're not looking for a reward." "I know, Rain, to help us." I understood now. I put the radio back up to my mouth and answered, Give the coordinates of the distress call to Hosna. Us and her army will assist the fortress. There was a pause before the answer. Done. I have no indications or evidence that this could go well, but I damn sure hope it goes smoothly. Hi, this is David Halem, and you just finished listening to Liminal Rain from my story, Status Stranded. I hope you enjoyed. See you next week.